following is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.cwrtdc.org.
So I want to say that Dr. Michael Burlingame currently holds the Chancellor Naomi Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois at Springfield. He was born right here in Washington, D.C., attended Phillips Academy in Andover, and he graduated from Princeton and with a PhD from Johns Hopkins. As a freshman at Princeton, Dr. Burlingame took the Civil War course taught by somebody we all know in the Lincoln group, David Herbert Donald, who took him under his wing and made him a research assistant in 1968. He then joined the history department at Connecticut College in New London, where he taught in the May Buckley Sadowski. He was the May Buckley Sadowski Professor of History, Emeritus, and he retired in 2001. Retirement didn't agree with him, apparently, because he joined the faculty of the University of Illinois at Springfield in 2009. Of course, he's the author of numerous books and publications, including Abraham Lincoln, A Life, the 2-volume green monster that he referred to in the inner world of Abraham Lincoln. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to everyone Dr. Michael Burlingame.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's good to see you again. And it's always an honor to be invited to speak to a group like yours, or both of yours. But it's a special honor to be invited back. So yeah, I've had the opportunity to speak to the Lincoln Group of Washington on more than one occasion, and I'm delighted to be able to do so once again. And what I'd like to share with you tonight is a chapter of a forthcoming book that's due out in June. Well, actually, the one that's due out it's due out in October. I have one book coming out in June, which is called An American Marriage: The Untold Story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. And then in October, I have another book coming out called Emphatically the Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln and Racial Equality. So it's from the latter book that I wish to share a chapter. And the title, by the way, Emphatically the Black Man's President, comes from a eulogy that Frederick Douglass delivered on June 1st, 1865, for Lincoln. He delivered it in Cooper Union, perhaps the premier spot to give a public oration in the United States. And in that speech, he said, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, the first to rise above the prejudice of his time and his country. By inviting me, Frederick Douglass, to the White House to consult on public affairs, he was saying, I am the president of the black people as well as the white people, and I mean to honor their rights as men and citizens. Now, this speech is not very well known. It's not in any of the anthologies of Douglass speeches, including the 5-volume set that the Yale University Press published back in the 90s, nor in any of the other anthologies, which is very surprising because it's in the Frederick Douglass Papers, the manuscript, and it was written up in the New York Times and the New York Herald and the New York Tribune fairly extensively in June of '65. And it stands in very stark contrast to the speech that you're all familiar with that he gave 11 years later in the city of Washington at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial, in which he said that Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. Well, 11 years earlier, he said he was emphatically the black man's president. And we needn't go into the reasons why he may have altered his tune in 1876. But anyway, that's where the book title comes from. And the focus of the book is unusual. That is to say, I'm not so much interested in Lincoln's policies, his pronouncements, his speeches, his letters, and the like in dealing with race. What I'm interested in is his interaction with Black people in Springfield and in Washington. Now, people know a little bit about Frederick Douglass's interaction with Lincoln, but there are an awful lot of other Black people that he did interact with. And my assumption is that interactions speak louder than words, and that Lincoln's interactions with Black people in both Springfield and Washington show him to be very much a racial egalitarian. Frederick Douglass testifies to that, but then a lot of others do as well. Eminent people like Sojourner Truth, Martin Delany, and the like, but also White House staff, cooks at a Washington hospital, lots and lots of people that he interacted with, both in Springfield and Washington, and show him to be instinctively a racial egalitarian. Anyhow, so one of the chapters of that book deals with one of the most controversial chapters in Lincoln biography, and that is his August 14th, 1862 meeting in the city of Washington with 5 Black leaders whom he had summoned to the White House. He was the first American president to invite Black people to come to the White House to consult on public affairs. Now, he was to do that later again in the Civil War, but that was the initial meeting. And he had summoned the leaders to talk about an appropriation that he was given by Congress to spend money, $600,000, which would be like maybe 20 million today, to promote colonization. When Congress passed the DC Emancipation Bill in April of 1862, it included a provision of $100,000 for helping Black people in Washington who wish to leave and to resettle abroad to help facilitate that. And then in July of 1862, when Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, Congress appropriated $500,000 more for the same purpose, except it wasn't earmarked just for Washingtonians, but for Black people in general. And so there Lincoln had $600,000 that Congress had appropriated to facilitate colonization. And so Lincoln wanted to know how Black people in Washington would like to see that spent. And so he sent word out through Black churches in Washington that he would like to meet with a delegation, and a group of Black people met in Washington at a church, and they chose a committee of 5 to call in the White House to discuss with the president this matter of how that money should be spent. Now, before I go into that meeting in detail, which I'd like to do this evening, I would like to sketch a little background. First of all, the notion that Abraham Lincoln was an early and ardent colonizationist is simply not true. That Lincoln was very late to join the colonization movement, and he was a rather lukewarm supporter of it. He was living in Springfield from 1837 to 1861. And in that 24-year period, colonization societies in the 1830s and 1840s sprung up, chapters of colonization societies in Springfield and the surrounding area, 3 of them. Lincoln did not join any of those. In the 1840s, a bunch of Whig lawyers, and Lincoln was a Whig lawyer in Central Illinois, they got together and formed the Illinois State Colonization Society. Lincoln was not a founding member of that. Lincoln did speak to that colonization society in the mid-1850s. And recently, a version of that speech has been unearthed, a newspaper account. And his speech to that colonization society was very lukewarm, hardly enthusiastic. He said it seemed like an idea worth pursuing, but was not endorsing it wholeheartedly by any means. And when Lincoln then, in 1852, when he first mentioned colonization, it was in a eulogy for Henry Clay. And that was a sort of passing reference that he paid tribute to Henry Clay as an opponent of slavery. And one of the things that Henry Clay had done as an opponent of slavery was to help found the American Colonization Society in 1816. And then Lincoln, in his first formal public political address, his great speech at Peoria in 1854, magnificent, one of his very best speeches. And it was his first major speech against slavery. And in the course of that, he does refer to colonization. But he says, well, on the one hand, it looks good on paper. In practice, it's really impracticable. That there isn't enough shipping, and if all the blacks in America were suddenly transported to Liberia, they'd all be dead within a couple of weeks because of disease. And in fact, the disease rate among immigrants to Liberia was very high in the 19th century. Let's not think of Lincoln as a colonization enthusiast from way back. Now, as president, of course, he does at this August 14th, 1862 meeting, sound as though he's an enthusiast, but that's relatively speaking a new tune for him. So another word of background, it's oftentimes thought in present day discussions of the subject that colonization is a policy that was designed to strengthen slavery by getting rid of free blacks in the South. People who had been slaves and were liberated, or their descendants of slaves who had been liberated. And that it was designed to shore up slavery by removing free blacks, because free blacks were thought to be undermining the very existence of slavery. In part because they were thought to be likely to encourage slave rebellions, and in part because the very fact that they were black and wandering about free meant that they were undermining the slaveholders' argument that the only reason you slaves are in bondage is because you're black. And if you could see free blacks wandering about, you think, well, no, wait a minute, they're free, they're black, I'm black, and I'm a slave. What's going on here? Now, in fact, when the Colonization Society got underway, the American Colonization Society got underway in 1816, there were a lot of Southern supporters of that who did, in fact, want to get rid of free blacks in order to strengthen slavery. But as time went by, a lot of Northerners joined the Colonization Society as idealists who wanted to undermine slavery, not strengthen it. And one of the ways to do that was to permit slaves to be free. And one of the mechanisms by which that would take place was that a lot of Southern whites in the post-Revolutionary War period had second thoughts about slavery, thought that it was incompatible with the ideology behind the American Revolution, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so they wanted to free their slaves, but they weren't so sure that they would be given a fair shake and that they would do it if the Colonization Society would guarantee that they would then be sent abroad or allowed to emigrate. And so when we think about who were colonizationists in the pre-Civil War period, it's important to recognize that that there were a lot of supporters and very serious supporters of the anti-slavery movement who also supported colonization, at least at some point in their careers. And among them were Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister who was one of the Secret Six who supported John Brown, who corresponded with and raised money for John Brown. Horace Greeley, the leading newspaper publisher and editor of the day, anti-slavery champion. Garrett Smith, who was a very well-to-do supporter of anti-slavery measures and who ran for president in 1860 on the Liberty Party, and who was quite well-to-do and really underwrote a lot of anti-slavery societies and activities. Salmon Chase, who was known as the Attorney General for runaway slaves, an anti-slavery radical from Ohio, became Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. He at one point had supported colonization. Harriet Beecher Stowe, and in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, she is clearly a colonizationist, a supporter of colonization, of having American slaves freed and resettled in Liberia. Thaddeus Stevens was perhaps the most radical racial egalitarian in Congress, a congressman from Pennsylvania. James G. Birney was the first presidential candidate running on any kind of anti-slavery platform in the Liberty Party in the 1840s. Benjamin Lundy, who established one of the first anti-slavery newspapers, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. Eli Thayer, a leader of the Kansas Immigrant Aid Society, to help the free soil settlers in Kansas resist the pro-slavery settlers. James Lane, a radical from Kansas who became a US Senator and a very outspoken opponent of slavery. So it's not as though all supporters of the colonization movement were pro-slavery, far from it. And in the cabinet, in Lincoln's cabinet, you had a minority, a slight minority of supporters for colonization in Postmaster General Blair, the Secretary of the Interior, Caleb B. Smith, and the Attorney General, Edward Bates. And in Congress, you had leading senators and congressmen who were supporters of colonization, who were also anti-slavery champions. Lyman Trumbull, who wrote the 13th Amendment, who wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1866, who championed the anti-slavery cause, was a colonizationist. And there were several others as well. So when Lincoln supported colonization at the August 14th, 1862 meeting with the Washington delegation, it wasn't as though he was being unique in his administration in calling for that policy. On top of that, there were a number of Black people who were colonizationists. And who were also very strong opponents of slavery, naturally. John Russwurm, Samuel Cornish, Alexander Crummell. Alexander Crummell actually lived in Liberia. James McCune Smith, James T. Holly, Martin Delaney, who met with Lincoln at some length, Henry Highland Garnett, Paul Cuffey, a very wealthy businessman and shipper, all supported colonization, especially in the 1850s. Black support for immigration to Liberia or else Haiti were the two main sources of refuge. In the 1850s, colonization became ever more popular among Blacks, largely because of the climate that emerged in the wake of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, then later on in the Dred Scott decision. And so as the climate of racial intolerance became more intense, the number of Blacks who supported colonization increased. And so it's thought that between 1830 and 1860, at least 20,000 American Blacks decided to emigrate, mostly to Liberia or Haiti. In 1862, at the time that Lincoln is meeting with the Black leaders of Washington, Congress received petitions from California from 242 Blacks who wanted to be colonized. And over 60 Washington Blacks also signed a petition saying that they would like to be colonized in Central America. In 1861, early in 1861, Frederick Douglass was urging Blacks to think about colonizing, that is, emigrating to Haiti. In fact, he accepted an invitation from the Haitian government to come and inspect the facilities in Haiti that would be extended, because the Haitians were urging American Blacks to come and settle in Haiti. The war came along and that rather got in the way. So colonization wasn't, as it's often portrayed, automatically we say, well, the colonizationist therefore was a white supremacist and a supporter of slavery. That's simply not the case. Now, the occasion for this meeting, as I suggested earlier, was the decision by Congress to give the president, to spend at his discretion, a substantial amount of money to facilitate colonization for any Black people who wanted to immigrate. It was not compulsory, it was voluntary. And so he had the $600,000 and wanted to know how Black people in Washington thought it should be spent. And I'm just a little curious that he didn't summon the Black leaders from Washington to come to the White House in the aftermath of the April statute abolishing slavery in Washington. It was in the aftermath of the July statute, the Second Confiscation Act, that Lincoln invited the Black people to come and talk. And you would have thought that since the $100,000 that was appropriated in April was earmarked for Washingtonians, that he would have summoned people to come, Black people to come and discuss how to spend that money. But he waited until August after the second appropriation was made. Now, so the leaders of the Black community who were an informal committee assembled at a Black church when dozens of Black people got together, and they decided, well, these five gentlemen should be our representatives and go to the White House. One of the striking things about that meeting, aside from the fact that it was the first time a president had invited Black people to come to consult on public affairs in the White House, is that Lincoln invited a shorthand reporter to take down what was said and to make sure that it was published in newspapers. This is something he didn't do ordinarily. It was extremely unusual and I think noteworthy. And I think it helps shed light on one of the reasons why Lincoln was publicly supporting colonization in a very dramatic fashion. Now, he had mentioned in his first annual message to Congress in 1861, in December, that there were a number of Blacks who had been liberated and who were in a kind of limbo, and some of them seemed to want to go abroad, and that money should be appropriated to make that possible. And so, he'd mentioned that in passing, but this meeting with the Black leaders was a major attempt by Lincoln to publicize the fact that he was sincere and in earnest when he was calling for colonization, that he was willing to spend money and to consult with Black leaders about where would be an appropriate place to go, how that should be organized, and that he wasn't just paying lip service to the idea of colonization. So let's take a look at the language that was used and that was taken down by the shorthand reporter. And one of the striking features of this meeting is that it was really Lincoln not consulting them, but urging them to consider supporting colonization and actually becoming volunteers, becoming pioneers to go abroad and to serve as trailblazers that might encourage other Blacks to follow in their wake. And so let me share with you some of the text of his remarks, which have generated quite a lot of controversy, both at the time they were issued and by subsequent commentators to this day. So anyway, the five prominent leaders of the Black community in Washington come to the White House on August 14th, 1862, and Lincoln welcomes them cordially and says, "You may wonder why I've called you here." Why, he asked, should people of your race be colonized? And where? Why should they leave this country? This is perhaps the first question for proper consideration. Well, fair enough. Then he says, you and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between any other two races. Whether it is right or wrong, I need not discuss, but the physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both. I think your race suffer very greatly, many of them by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence. In a word, we suffer on each side. If this is admitted, it affords a reason, at least, why we should be separated. You are freemen, I suppose. And they say, yes. And he says, perhaps you have long been free, all your lives. And then he goes on to say something quite startling. He says, your race are suffering, in my judgment, the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. Let me repeat that. Your race are suffering, in my judgment, the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. That is referring to slavery. But even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the Black race. With equality with the white race. You are cut off from many of the advantages which the other race enjoys, that is the white race. The aspiration of men is to enjoy equality with the best when free. But on this broad continent, not a single man of your race is made the equal of a single man of ours. Go where you are treated the best, and the ban is still upon you. So here's Lincoln quite frankly acknowledging that the North, and that free Blacks in the North are suffering from grievous discrimination, that the ban is still upon you. And of course, in fact, in the North, Black people were systematically discriminated against, except in New England. New England had the only states which allowed Blacks to vote on an equality with whites. And that didn't include Connecticut, by the way, where I happen to be speaking from tonight. But 94% of Black people in the North lived in states where they couldn't vote. And there was discrimination in housing and education and transportation and public facilities and the whole 9 yards. And Lincoln, of course, comes from Illinois. And Illinois was arguably the most negrophobic state in the Union. The Black laws of Illinois were infamous. They not only forbade Black people from voting, holding office, sitting on juries, testifying against whites in court, serving in militias and the like, but Illinois pioneered a new wrinkle in the discrimination game, and that was to forbid Black people to settle in the state. In 1847, a new constitution was written for Illinois, replacing the one that had first been established when the state entered the Union in 1818. And the 1847 Constitutional Convention produced a document that was ratified by 70% of the vote in 1848. And one of the provisions in that brand new Constitution of 1848 was a provision that provided for the legislature to pass a law forbidding Blacks to settle in the state. This is 1848. Not long thereafter, Indiana passes a law to that effect. Oregon adopts a law to that effect. Kansas adopts a law to that effect. And Illinois actually doesn't get around to passing the law until 1853. But in 1848, it had laid down the marker. It said the legislature is now authorized and empowered to forbid black settlement. And so, Lincoln knows with some authority about the depth and extent of racism in the North, and particularly in Illinois. And let's remember that in 1858, when Lincoln was campaigning for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas engaged in the most flagrant race baiting. The speeches that Douglas made in the 1858 campaign, both in the course of the debates and then elsewhere in Illinois, were flagrant, outrageous bids for the support of the large number of Illinoisans who did not like black people and didn't want to have to associate with them. Douglas was shameless in his appeals to race prejudice. And Douglas won the election, in part because he was so effective in appealing to white people's prejudice. So Lincoln says, okay, slavery is an outrageous wrong, and you're mistreated even when you can't be slaves. And I think this is a key to understanding Lincoln's support for colonization. That Lincoln was convinced that white racism was so endemic, so widespread, so deep-seated, that black people were never going to get a fair shake in the United States. And he believed that those black people who shared that belief should have a haven, should have a refuge someplace in the world where they could go to escape from systematic oppression that they suffered both in the slave states and in the free states. Now, he goes on to say, I do not propose to discuss this, that is, that there's gross discrimination, but to present it as a fact with which we have to deal. This is we, you and I together. I cannot alter it if I would. So here Lincoln suggests that if he had the power to alter it, he might well be willing to do it. But he says, I cannot alter it if I would. It is a fact about which we all think and feel alike, I and you. So he says, here's real empathy. He says, look, I'm in your camp. I see the world the way you do. I think this is an outrage. We look to our condition owing to the existence of the two races on this continent. I need not recount to you the effects upon white men growing out of the institution of slavery. See our present condition, our country engaged in war, our white men cutting one another's throats, none knowing how far it will extend. And then consider what we know to be the truth. But for your race among us, there could not be war. Although many men are engaged in it on either side, do not care for you one way or the other. Nevertheless, I repeat, without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence. Now, you might think that the black people who are hearing Lincoln say this said, look, it's not our fault. We didn't ask to come here. Don't blame us. And that's a perfectly legitimate and reasonable response. But by the same token, it is also, I think, pretty clear that the Civil War would not have happened if it had not been for the South's desire to maintain white supremacy at all costs. That preserving slavery was not simply a matter of protecting the economic interest of the planter class, although that was certainly part of it. But the white population in general derived psychological profits, if not economic profits, from knowing that no matter how enlightened, no matter how intelligent, no matter how articulate, no matter how accomplished a black person was, he was infinitely below the most ignorant, backward, superstitious, drunken, violent white person. And that ego-warming benefit of knowing that you, even though you weren't a planter, and you might be a very poor white, that you still had the psychological benefit of knowing that you were infinitely higher on the socioeconomic ladder than any black person. And without that ferocious desire on the part of the white South to maintain white supremacy at all costs, the Civil War would not have occurred. And if there hadn't been a black population of over 4 million in the 15 states that comprised the slave states, there could not have been a war. So Lincoln makes a good point, a little tactless perhaps, but just telling a blunt truth. So he goes on to say, it is better for us, therefore, to be separated. I know that there are free men among you who, even if they could better their condition, are not as much inclined to go out of the country as those who, being slaves, could obtain their freedom on this condition. That is, Lincoln here is acknowledging that there are slaveholders who would liberate their slaves if the slaves would then emigrate. And so what Lincoln is suggesting here is that if you help establish a colony where black people who are liberated could go, there would be a lot more manumissions. A lot more slaves would have been manumitted by their owners if the owners were sure that there was a place where the freed slaves would go abroad. So he appeals to them as to their sense of altruism. That you may have a comfortable life now living in Washington. The conditions are not ideal, to be sure, but you might feel that that's a lot more suitable than going to Liberia, and Lincoln says Liberia is not an ideal spot. It's too far away. Customs are different. It's too far it's such a long voyage, and tropical diseases are so significant that Liberia is not an ideal option. And then he goes on to talk about the depth of white racism. He says, there is an unwillingness on the part of our people, that is white people, harsh as it may be, for you free colored people to remain with us. Now, if you could give a start to the white people, that is, show them that there's this haven that the freed slaves could go to, you would open up wide a door for many to be made free. And then he goes on to say that the people that he's talking to, the 5 gentlemen he's talking to, are clearly cultivated, educated, sophisticated people. If we deal with those who are not free at the beginning, that is, if the pioneers are going to be slaves, and whose intellects are clouded by slavery. Now here Lincoln is suggesting that insofar as there's an intellectual difference between white people and blacks, particularly black slaves, it has nothing to do with biological inferiority. It has to do with intellects clouded by slavery, not biology, but by slavery. If we have pioneers who are slaves with intellects clouded by slavery, we have very poor materials to start with. If intelligent colored men, such as are before me, would move in this matter, much might be accomplished. It is exceedingly important that we have men at the beginning capable of thinking as white men, and not those who have been systematically oppressed. So what Lincoln is here saying is that black people can clearly be the equals of whites if they are not systematically oppressed. Then he goes on to say, there is much to encourage you. For the sake of your race, you should sacrifice something of your present comfort for the purpose of being as grand in that respect as the white people. Then he goes on to elaborate on Liberia and saying why that's not particularly attractive. And then he says, I do not know how much attachment you may have toward our race. It does not strike me that you have the greatest reason to love them, but still you are attached to them at all costs, and you don't want to go to Liberia. You don't want to go that far away from the place where you were born and raised. And then he moves along and says, if such persons have what will be an advantage to them, the question is whether it cannot be made an advantage to you. That is, there were some people who were saying that we don't like this colonization idea because it reeks of corruption. There's some people making some money off this that are their motives are suspect. And he goes to say to these gentlemen, you are intelligent, and you know that success does not so much depend on external help as on self-reliance. Much, therefore, depends upon yourselves. And then he goes on to talk about how Black people moving to Panama, he suggests Panama would be a much more suitable place to establish a colony, and that there is a portion of Panama which is owned by a private company. It has a lot of coal, and you could go there and you could get right off, you could be self-sufficient right off the bat by mining coal. To go to a place where you would have to establish a farm, to clear land, to plant a crop, and then wait for it to mature and then harvest it and then sell it, that's awkward. But if you go and you can actually mine coal right off the bat, you can be self-sustaining without that long waiting period. And then he goes and says, apropos of Panama, he says, I shall, if I get a sufficient number of you engaged, have provision made that you shall not be wronged. You will have to be treated as first-class citizens. I would not send you to a country where you would be treated as second-class citizens, as you are in most of the states of the Union. If you will engage in the enterprise, I will spend some of the money entrusted to me. I'm not sure you will succeed. The government may lose the money, but we cannot succeed unless we try. But we think with care we can succeed. I would endeavor to have you made equals, that is, equals before the law, and have the best assurance that you should be equals of the best. And he also goes on to say that the political situation in Central America is not ideal, that the land that in Panama that is going to be used there's a dispute whether that belongs to Costa Rica or whether that belongs to New Grenada, which was Colombia. But that seems to be something that can be ironed out. And so Lincoln makes this appeal, and the five gentlemen say that we will take it under advisement. We'll get back to you. And the leader of the chairman of the five-man delegation writes back and says, well, we were pretty skeptical when we first came to the White House about this colonization plan. But upon consideration, I, for one, think that it's pretty good. And my colleagues think that we should go and discuss the matter with other Black people in other cities, so in New York and Philadelphia, for example, and asks for support to do that kind of research. And that doesn't pan out. And then ultimately, the five-man delegation does not give an official report. But the reaction in Washington among Blacks was mixed. There had been a pretty fierce debate just before this meeting in July of 1862, a month before Lincoln meets with the five Black leaders. There had been a ruckus in Washington because there were some recruiters for Haiti and Liberia in Washington urging Black people to sign up. And there was a strong anti-colonization sentiment among Washington Blacks. And some of them went and beat up, physically assaulted the recruiters who were urging Black people to sign petitions saying that they would like to be colonized. There was an organization that was devoted to proving that Black people could, in fact, thrive in the United States despite the conditions they were living under in Washington. And they were militantly opposed to colonization. That was their main thrust. But there were plenty of Washingtonians who did, as soon as this plan was put forward, sign up, volunteered. And ultimately, there were about 20,000 Blacks who volunteered to go to Panama. Now, Frederick Douglass went ballistic, and lots of other Black leaders, prominent Blacks, came out and denounced Lincoln. And Douglass was particularly, he said Lincoln is now clearly a master of the slave power and all that. Really pretty harsh rhetoric. But ironically, get this, while Frederick Douglass is denouncing this program in the most vehement terms, his two oldest sons volunteer to go to Cherokee, to go to Panama. And Douglass then writes to a friend and says, geez, I am bitterly disappointed by this. But you can imagine if Douglass's sons think it's a legitimate undertaking, the vehemence with which Douglass denounced it seems a little overdetermined, shall we say. Now, Lincoln's motives in promoting this are not simply rooted in his desire that there should be a haven for Black people who are so pessimistic about the future that they should have a place that they can go to and be treated like first-class citizens. That there may not be many who want to do that, but that we owe it to that we white people owe it to them to make that possibility available. And no coercion, this is not going to be forced. Now, one of the reasons there was such strong resistance among Blacks is that they thought it was the stepping stone, voluntary colonization was the stepping stone to compulsory colonization. But Lincoln had at no point indicated any support for that. He was quite emphatic about that. Now, another equally important consideration that was on Lincoln's mind in mid-August of 1862 was, how is the public going to react to the Emancipation Proclamation? As you all know, on July 22nd, Lincoln tells his cabinet, I'm going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm not asking whether you think it's a good idea or not. I'm telling you, I'm going to do it. But I'm willing to hear your suggestions for improving it or modifying it. And when Secretary of State Seward says, sir, we have just suffered a grievous military reverse on the peninsula in Virginia. McClellan's army has come within sight of Richmond and has been repulsed. If we issue on the heels of that defeat an Emancipation Proclamation, it's going to seem like a desperation move, and it will not be regarded as sincere by any reasonable people, including foreigners who might be affected by that if they believe that it was sincere. And so Lincoln says, Seward, I hadn't thought of that. Okay, I'll put it in my desk drawer and then we'll whip it out when there's a military victory. So there's Lincoln thinking, I'm going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And I know that there's going to be a strong white backlash because there are lots and lots and lots of white people in the North who say, I will be glad to serve in the army and I will be glad to pay high taxes in order to fight the war to preserve the Union. But I'll be damned if I'm going to join the army, and I'll be damned if I'm going to pay taxes in order to liberate the slaves. To hell with that. And this was particularly true in the border states and the lower North, that is Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, Southern Ohio, Southern Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky. And so Lincoln was thinking, how can I reduce and minimize the white backlash that I know is going to come once the Emancipation Proclamation is promulgated? And so and he's been told by members of Congress, by friends of his in Kentucky, that he said, people in these states will simply not accept emancipation unless it is coupled with colonization. Time and again, my constituents, senators and congressmen would come to the White House and tell Lincoln, my constituents say, we will not support emancipation unless it is coupled with colonization. So one of the things Lincoln was doing was to try to grease the skids for the Emancipation Proclamation, to reduce the backlash that he knew would be generated by this remarkable step forward. And so, and it was part of a general strategy. A few days after Lincoln's meeting with the 5 black leaders, which he then publicized, as I say, with a shorthand reporter, because he wanted the people in the lower north and in the border states to know, white people to know that he was in earnest about colonization, that he wasn't just paying lip service to that if the Emancipation Proclamation were to come about, it would in fact be coupled with colonization. So you wouldn't have to worry about whether black people would then, you would be coexisting with black people. But of course, unless it was compulsory, most black people weren't going to go. But this was in part a public relations effort on Lincoln's part to calm down the potential resentment and disagreement with emancipation that he thought was bound to occur. And a few days after this, he writes the famous letter to Horace Greeley, in which he says, whatever I do regarding the black race and slavery, I do because it helps to save the Union. If I could free all the slaves, if that would best helps preserve the Union, I'd do that. If I could leave the slaves in bondage, and that would best help preserve the Union, I'd do that. If I could free some and leave others in bondage, I would do that. And so this too was a way to grease the skids for the acceptance of emancipation, that emancipation would be not a war aim, but a means to achieve the end. And that end was preserving the Union and vindicating democracy. And so the meeting with the 5 black leaders in Washington, I think, should be regarded in the same way that we should regard the Greeley letter, that it was a way to help persuade public opinion that the war was still going to be a war about union, and that emancipation would not be something that would be very difficult for people in general to swallow. Now, do we have any evidence that this was Lincoln's intention? Well, a British correspondent for a London paper, The Star, when Congress passed the law back in April, providing money for colonization, he writes, it says, Europeans are going to have a hard time understanding what this is all about. But this was a provision to shore up the weak-nerved, of which there are legion. That is, people who would be scandalized by emancipation, white people who would be. So it was to shore up the weak-nerved and also to provide a haven for blacks who wanted to leave. So here's a contemporary saying that that's what Lincoln was up to. And then I'd like to share with you a comment by a black person, a leading black figure, so Henry Highland Garnett. And Garnett offers the same general interpretation. Now, Henry Highland Garnett was a leading black minister, Presbyterian minister in New York. And he believed that Lincoln's plan to establish a haven for African Americans in Central America was, and this is his writing at the time, would be, he said, the most humane and merciful movement which this or any other administration has proposed for the benefit of the enslaved. That's pretty strong language. And he goes on to say that the free and voluntary immigration of our people to any portion of the globe is among the most sacred of all human rights. And Garnett believed that this is one of God's ways by which the families of the earth are improved and advanced in national character. And then he asks rhetorically, but a very practical question: where are the freed people of the South to seek a refuge? Neither the North, the West, nor the East will receive them. Nay, even our colored people of the North do not want them here. They say, both black and white, those Southern Negroes, if they come here, will reduce the price of labor and take the bread out of our mouths. Garnett feared that the newly emancipated slaves might be captured by Confederates and re-enslaved, which did happen, to some blacks during the war. If Jeff Davis does not emancipate the slaves of the Confederacy, Garnett said, and our government does not provide a territory on this continent as a refuge for those who have been freed by our armies, then the condition of these people will be worse than it ever was before. When they again fall into the hands of their tormentors, they will be tortured as human beings were never tortured in this world. And Confederate forces did indeed torture, murder, and mutilate some African-American troops who were captured, as you well know. But he goes on to say, if Lincoln's plan were adopted, Garnett predicted, hundreds of thousands of men will be saved, and the northern bugbear will all come, they will all come here, will be removed. Now, Garnett supported immigration only for those who wanted to move and those who had the means to prosper. He told his fellow blacks, we are planted here and we cannot as a whole people be recolonized back to the fatherland. So there's a leading black supporter of the anti-slavery cause defending Lincoln's statement to the 5 black gentlemen. And there's lots of reason to believe that Lincoln's empathy for black people and his understanding that most black people are not going to want to move, but that there are some who are so pessimistic about that prospect of ever getting a fair shake from white Americans is so ingrained that they do deserve a refuge. They do deserve someplace where they can go and be treated like first-class citizens. Now, Lincoln then has to abandon the Panama Plan. It turns out that the governments of Central America were opposed. And he does then, unfortunately then, and rather impulsively, sign a contract which allows for black immigration to Haiti. And about 450 American blacks do go in 1863 to Haiti. They come back in 1864. Almost all of them who haven't died in Haiti come back, and it was a disaster. But so the number of blacks who were actually involved in any colonization was minuscule. It was at 450 out of over 4.5 million. And most of them came back. And the amount of money that was spent, $600,000 was appropriated, about $30,000 was spent. So that when we think about colonization, we have to recognize that it was undertaken on a very minuscule scale, and that Lincoln's support for it was not based on his desire to deport all black people and because of his racial prejudice, far from it. It was his sympathy for blacks who were deeply pessimistic about their future in the United States and who believed that they would be better off in a foreign country if they could be guaranteed some kind of first-class citizenship. So that's the burden of my song, and I'd be happy to try to field any questions or comments that you may have.
Michael, you mentioned a lot of different ways or a lot of different reactions in the North. Do we have any information on how the Confederate states, the newspapers, civilian leaders reacted to this meeting and his meeting with the representatives regarding colonization?
I tell you the truth, I haven't really investigated that because I wasn't much interested in it. I assumed that
Can't imagine that they would be too positive either way on that. Paul asks, did Thomas Jefferson require newly emancipated persons who were enslaved to leave Virginia?
Jefferson's version of colonization did involve coercion, compulsion. Now, Lincoln didn't.
So Lincoln was, if they wanted to go, they could go, but there was nobody that was going to push them to go.
Exactly. Even though some people in his cabinet wanted that, including the Attorney General, Edward Bates. And during the debates over the emancipation of Washington, D.C. slaves, during that debate, there was a motion to make colonization mandatory. And it split 50-50. That is, there were 20 Senate votes in favor, 20 votes against, and the Vice President, Hannibal Hamlin, voted against it and defeated it. But so there was a fair amount of strong support for compulsory colonization, at least in the Senate during that spring of 1862.
You said that Lincoln he said that white people were suffering because of the presence of black people. What do you mean by that?
They were cutting each other's throats. That 750,000 got killed because of the existence of black slavery in the South. And if there hadn't been any blacks, there would have been no desire to maintain white supremacy at all costs. There wouldn't have been a war, and there wouldn't have been that many deaths.
Was there a kind of follow up to that? Was there a strong support nation, and at least in the North, for colonization prior to the war?
Among the whites in the lower North, and the upper South, and the border states, that's where you had the strongest support. And black support, as I indicated, was particularly strong. Not a majority support, to be sure, but particularly strong in the 1850s.
Okay, you you mentioned some things about why the Congress allocated the money for colonization. The early one you mentioned, the British correspondent. Here's a question. It says, was Congress attempting to jumpstart a national policy for colonization by starting to allocate money targeted to Washingtonians exclusively? So is Congress trying to get a colonization program really running?
It seems that way, although it should be noted that when Lincoln gave his State of the Union message, what we would call the State of the Union message, in December '61, he said that we have a number of blacks who have been liberated by our forces, and some of them should have at least have the opportunity to have some kind of refuge, and that might involve an appropriation from Congress and negotiation with foreign powers, and so Lincoln actually recommended it, and Congress then appropriated money, in part because of Lincoln's recommendation in his State of the Union message.
But these were religious leaders that came to this meeting.
Well, not really. They weren't ministers.
Okay.
They had been organized by they had been organized by ministers, and some were business people, but it's not five ministers.
Was there a difference between various religious denominations and how they stood on colonization?
Yes. The AME Church, the American African Methodist Episcopal Church leaders in Washington were sympathetic to colonization. Other leaders weren't, and it's one of the striking features about the 5-member delegation that went to Washington, to the White House from Washington, was that the AME leaders weren't there. That Lincoln would have found a much more sympathetic audience if he had handpicked Garnett and people like that. Henry Neal Turner, for example, in Washington, who was quite enthusiastic about colonization. So yeah, the AME was more inclined to favor, and other churches Baptist, Methodist Church were more apt to oppose.
Let me ask this one. This is that, did the U.S. play a role in establishing Liberia?
Yes.
And creating their system of government?
Right. It was Liberia was established by the American Colonization Society, a private outfit, and which had some money from the federal government to start with, but not much. So it was more of a private enterprise, which led to the establishment. And not Liberia then becomes a country, an independent country, and not just an outpost of the American Colonization Society in 1847, I believe it was.
Okay. Did Lincoln change his initial feelings of colonization based on reading Uncle Tom's Cabin?
No, as far as we know, he didn't read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then the story that he met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said that this is the little lady that started the war. I've never found any significant evidence to suggest that was in fact what he said. It sounds like him, but I don't think it's true. And Lincoln's, one of the striking features about Lincoln after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, is that from then on he doesn't talk about colonization, doesn't promote it. And I think one of the reasons is that the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, contained a provision that blacks could serve in the army. And at that point, it was thought, these people can be very valuable asset in helping to suppress the rebellion by serving in the army. And so that, I think, helped persuade Lincoln that to de-emphasize colonization. Now, there were still some feeble attempts. There were still some overtures being made by the British government, and the Dutch government, the Danish government, who had West Indian possessions, but they suffered from a labor shortage, and they wanted American blacks to come down there. And so Lincoln, the Lincoln administration did some negotiations that came to never reached fruition. So colonization didn't completely disappear, but Lincoln really didn't talk about it publicly again, and really didn't put much emphasis behind it. The disaster of the Haitian group that went in the spring of '63 and came back later was also helped make him disenchanted with the idea of colonization.
John Willen, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I think you alluded to this a little bit. Would Lincoln have had a more receptive audience, if you will, if he met with AME leaders instead of the guys that he met with?
Yes, he would.
Who were not associated with that church, actually.
Right. He probably would have, yeah.
This is an interesting question. There's one I skipped over, by the way, because I think it's like an entire lifetime of argument to give an answer for that. So if we have time, I may go back to that. But this is an interesting question in the sense is, was there resentment of the idea that people who built the infrastructure here over generations should abandon it and go somewhere else and start over?
Sure. A lot of black people felt that way, understandably.
So today we look back at it and you say, well, we think about, people who were enslaved at the time. They were literally building the Capitol and building all of the infrastructure. And they had multiple generations living in the United States. And then we're saying, well, okay, fine, you can be free, but you have to leave.
Well, you don't have to, but you have the option to do so if you think that you'll never get a fair break. There was
another question here. What happened to colonization effort following the Civil War?
Well, and some of the people who were involved in this story, Henry Highland Garnett and particularly Henry McNeill Turner, were in the 1890s, particularly Henry McNeill Turner, active in promoting return to Africa, particularly as I say, in the 1890s when things really got bad, when lynching was on the upswing and the last shards of Reconstruction were being disassembled, so there was some sense that that might be a good idea. And then, of course, it comes up with Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. Although that tended to be, Marcus Garvey's movement was officially back to Africa, but it was more a resentment of dark-skinned blacks against the kind of snooty attitude that light-skinned blacks had toward them, and sort of a class revolt within the black community. And actually, you saw some of that in the Lincoln White House. When Lincoln came to Washington in 1861, he brought with him a young man from Springfield who was dark-skinned black, who would work be his body servant, his valet, and also work in the White House and the staff. And the black people on the staff in the White House were all light-skinned, and they practically had a revolt and said, we will not accept this dark-skinned guy as one of us. And so Lincoln had, within days of taking the oath of office, he was scrambling around trying to find employment for this gentleman that he had, the dark-skinned black gentleman that he had brought with him from Springfield, William Johnson. So that was one of the considerations that Lincoln had to deal with when he thought about people being, the color prejudice even affected light-skinned blacks, were color prejudice against dark-skinned blacks.
Which I think is still true. Concha has a couple of questions, so I'm going to merge them. Why Haiti, and was the Episcopalian Church in favor of blacks leaving the country?
Well, no, well, Haiti, of course, was Catholic, French speaking, and so it wasn't ideal. And the promises that were extended to American blacks by the government of Haiti were oftentimes not honored. About 2,000 blacks left to go to Haiti in the early stages of the war, from 1860 to 1862, even before the war, and almost all of them came back. They found the conditions, they were being treated very shabbily by the Haitians. Oops, I've got to go teach a class. So excuse me. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, we thank you for an excellent presentation.
Well, you're very kind.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, and now remember, I've got this book coming out in June called American Marriage, and one called Emphatically the Black Man's President in the fall. Now, be sure to buy them. You don't have to read them, but be sure to buy them. Okay?
So you'll come back.
I definitely want to read it.
Okay, thanks again. I've got to scoot.